You're on.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So some time ago, I figure maybe Magnet Mind David could tell us exactly when, but it was either last year or the year before. I took us on an exploration of 3 of the 4 weeks of the leading up to Christmas, that period of time that much of Christendom calls Advent. We delved into the topics of peace and hope and joy that year. And although we didn't have an actual Advent wreath, which, believe it or not, New Garden traditionally has an Advent wreath.
We used to have one.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so I knew most of you had seen one. That evergreen wreath borrowed from the ancient Celtic traditions that has 4 candles, 3 purple and a pink one on the outside, and then the white one in the center. The outer candles are symbolic of the 4 gifts of God that were birthed at Christmas. And one is lit each week during the month before Christmas. And if you do remember, the white candle in the middle is lit on Christmas Day and represents the Christ light in all of creation. At least to me it does. Since I wasn't here all 4 weeks of that Advent that year, I missed the opportunity to talk on the topic of love. And quite coincidentally, if you notice, today is the first day, Sunday, in Advent. And I thought, oh yay, I get to go back and touch on what I missed way back whenever I did it. So my thinking is, today, let's talk about love.
Amen.
Yeah. So none of the symbols that are represented by the Advent wreath, to me, the Advent wreath candles, those aren't simple topics. If we're talking hope or peace or joy or love, they're all complex considerations in an increasingly complex world. And I thought of it much like the Inuits in Canada and Alaska have at least 53 words for our single word of snow, that we have kind of the same spread of words connected to the word love. I started making a list, and it's like, wow, this is a multifaceted crystal, this word love. I thought of everything from puppy love to platonic love to, tough love and love at first sight. And I thought about also how 1,000 times a day, oh, I love ... whatever that is. We just kind of throw it out there. So the concepts of love themselves are as deep as they are wide. But when we frame that exploration of love within the Advent season, and then we take it again and focus it a little more with the ministry of Jesus, we can see why love's so important that it gets its own candle on the Advent wreath. So of all the teachings of Yeshua, the rabbi, love is the central theme. You could probably take out all of what's in the Christian scriptures and just put love, and that would capture it. In the Christian Gospel of Matthew, Jesus instructs his followers to love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul. And it's not that that's the first time that's ever been heard by that group. He draws from the Shema, which is the daily prayer, twice daily prayer of the Jewish people, even in the time of Jesus. That comes from the Hebrew book of Deuteronomy. It's chapter 6, verse 5. And he emphasizes, though, that this is the first and the greatest commandment. No, thou shalt not anything, but love the Lord your God with everything you have. But then, of course, there's a PS to a lot of what Jesus says. He follows it with what he calls the second greatest commandment. And that is that we love our neighbor as ourself. Universal love for God, altruistic love for neighbor, and unconditional love for self. I like to imagine the possibility that maybe, just maybe, and I know y'all won't throw tomatoes at me when I say this, that if there really, really was a Holy Trinity, it would be these three kinds of love. With that in mind, I want us to look at each kind of love a little closer as we spark the light of love in this Christmas season. So let's start with the first commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul. This important directive from Jesus demands that we dedicate our entire beingness to something that is greater than ourselves. And to do that with love means that we live by motivating principles like compassion, wisdom, reverence, because it's something beyond ourselves, perhaps with awe. But to love God with all your heart and mind and soul would require a holistic harmony between our thoughts and feelings, our spirits, our actions, all have to have some unifying factor there. You can't be like my daddy who would say, don't do as I do, do as I say do. You can't actually say one thing and think another thing altogether different. It all has to be unified. So in a workshop I presented at Quaker Lake Camp 100 years ago, yes, I actually did present a workshop at Quaker Lake Camp. I was teaching about the importance of and the use of inclusive language. So this one gentleman asked me, he was being quite honest, well, can't I use words about other people that are derogatory just as long as I don't say it to their face? Can't I say what I want to say in my own house? And my answer to him was, if we are to love God with all our hearts and minds and souls, what would that say about you to speak meanly of someone in private, even if no one else heard you? So that first commandment is really a tall order. When we break it down to exactly how can I integrate this love for God, or whatever language you want to use for that which is bigger than us, into our daily lives. So now I want to jump to what I call the compound commandment. It's the second prescription that Jesus gives, and that is to love your neighbor as yourself. 5 words. I think there are a lot of wonderful human beings, just like friends here at Winston-Salem meeting, who do a great job of the first part of that commandment. Even if it's something as simple as bringing oatmeal and cereal, or putting pennies in a jar, or throwing extra coins into the kettle for the Salvation Army. Loving our neighbor is really doable, even on a small scale. But when our neighbor doesn't look like us, or sound like us, or dress like us, or act like us, when our neighbor across the table, or across the county, or the country, or across the globe has polar opposite beliefs from our own, that's when our neighbor begins to look more like an enemy. Which is, I think, probably the very reason that Jesus had already said to his followers to not only love their enemies, but to pray for them as well. And believe it or not, every major world religion, and even the minor ones, includes some type of teaching like this in their books of wisdom. To me, the very truth of this commandment, love your neighbor as yourself, doesn't even require that you follow any kind of deity. To use this as a guiding principle for living a good life. Love for our neighbor as well as our enemy grows when we have compassion and forgiveness, empathy, understanding, and what I think takes a whole lot of patience. But social justice, environmental conservation, peace and reconciliation, all of that rises up out of that first part of that commandment, to love our neighbor. Loving God without loving your neighbor, to me, can lead to piety and self-righteousness. I think the Pharisees are a perfect example of that singular focus of love. They loved their God, weren't much on loving their neighbor. Loving God as well as our neighbor is important, but we must include the third and final step in these two commandments, to be completely transformed by the power of love. And to me, I have observed that it's the hardest one to accomplish, and that is love for self. Y'all know that the topic of self-love is so important to me that I wrote a book about it. It's that old saying that we teach what we most need to learn. And that was the main reason behind my book. The truth is, we cannot give love to others, including a higher power, if we don't have love for ourselves. That compassion, forgiveness, and ton of patience is just as necessary for our own well-being as it is for the well-being of others. Loving our neighbors without loving ourselves moves us towards codependency, and I think it puts us at risk for burnout. If we don't or can't or won't learn to love ourselves, we can grow to be resentful of the very people we're trying to love. It's like feeding someone else when your own bowl is empty. When it comes to self-love, I think our cultural influences are sadly lacking, despite our constant emphasis on how we look and what we own, that exterior kind of thing. When the second someone mentions self-love, the words like selfish and self-centered get thrown into the mix. I prefer to call it self-oriented. In first day school, in a class I led on the topic of self-love, it was shortly after I had released my book, there was one very vocal friend who made it quite clear that self-love is a sin. She couldn't quite clarify why she felt that way, and I never figured out if her long-standing and overt bitterness at the world made it hard for her to grasp the concept of loving herself, or if it was the other way around. She simply rejected the truth that loving ourselves can be a pathway to personal and spiritual growth. I don't think Jesus would have said, love your neighbor as yourself, if it wasn't important. Self-love can break the cycle of animosity and victimhood, and it contributes to our ability to love God and others more fully. So we have two very simple statements, even though they're the first and second greatest commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and mind and soul. Love your neighbor as yourself. So this week, as you kindle the flame of love, Advent love in your heart, let it radiate outward to God and to others, guiding your body and mind and soul. And may that love light find its way into the recesses of your own heart, that you might recognize the beauty and strength of your being. And with every breath and every step we take this week toward the coming of the Christ light, let us walk in the light of the transforming power of love. So in the name of universal love, altruistic love, and unconditional self-love, so it is. Amen.